And good morning, everyone. I'm Tasha Davenport, Casbo's CEO, and I'm just so pleased that we're going to be diving into this conversation about budget advisory committees today to help us as we explore, the fiscal challenges, ways to build trust, both in our community and with our districts, and certainly support negotiations. I'm joined today by two experts in the field. The first I want to introduce is the Assistant Superintendent of Business Services for Pleasanton USD. That's Ahmad Sheikul Salami. And I also want to welcome Matt Phillips, who is the Associate Vice President of School Services of California. So welcome, gentlemen. Ahmad is, again, the Assistant Superintendent, so we're going to get that perspective. Certainly you're aware of school services and their reputation and negotiation around the state. So we'll have a rich conversation. So I'll let you all just ask questions as you might have them arise. We are taking questions through Q&A today, not through text, but through the Q&A button so that we can follow up should we not have an answer, or if we should happen to run out of time, which I do not think is going to be the case. The webinar is being recorded. And so following the completion and the spooling or whatever takes place behind the scenes, we will be getting that link out to all of our registered participants in today's session. So with that, let me share my screen. One moment. All right. I'm going to confirm that you can see the presentation.
Yeah.
All
Looks
right.
good on my side.
Wonderful. So the first thing that we want to do is just set the stage. And Matt, I'm going to go to you just to talk about some of those stressors that are would motivate someone to consider a advisory committee.
Yeah, thanks, Tasha. Good morning, everyone, and hi, Maud. Thanks for joining me on this one. Honored to have you as a co-presenter with Tasha.
Happy to be here
as well. So, we get questions a lot at school services, and many folks who have joined school business in the last 5, 10, 15, almost 20 years now may not have heard of a budget advisory committee. And so I'm going to, harken back to, Ron Bennett. And Ron was a man of many quotes. And the way that he framed it for me was very simple. He goes, well, school boards are elected officials. They have no problem spending money when money is available to be spent, right? So we think about the good times, money's been flowing in. School boards like to spend the money. They are elected specifically with that responsibility. When times get bad, school boards don't necessarily want to be on the front line of making those reductions. And so you generally would associate a budget advisory committee with a downturn in the economy. Some of the things that we would see present, and we'll dive into this more, but some of those common factors, declining enrollment, deficit spending, certainly not only in the first year, but in the two out years, maybe even getting into a situation with school closures. That's when many LEAs will look to their community to say, hey, we are elected officials here on your behalf. We don't want to make these decisions in isolation because every decision is going to be felt and it's going to impact certain cohorts of the community. So we want to come together and we want to have this discussion together, right? So BACs, it's almost kind of I don't want to say it's a bad word, but it is correlated to when times generally aren't going along as well. So some of those distressors, and these are not new. I'll hit on maybe the first couple, and then I'll hand it over to Ahmad to share his local experience. Certainly declining enrollment. We know as a state, we've been in declining enrollment. If you go back to the early 2000s, the state peaked at about 6.2 million students in the TK-12 system. And we're now down to about 5.4 million students in that system. So we're looking statewide at more than a 10% reduction in enrollment overall. And we know that varies locally, right? Your experience varies. You have some LEAs in the Central Valley. You get down to the Southern California and the high desert. You're seeing growth year over year, and that's great. Growth is king. We love growth. growth hides a lot of problems that would otherwise be present. But that means that for the rest of the state, that 10% is amplified because it's more concentrated in the state. There's districts that over that time period have lost 30%, 40% of their kids. And we know that while we're not funded on enrollment, certainly the average daily attendance that is derived from the enrollment and that is really our lifeblood for funding is adversely impacted. We talk about this all the time at school services. Yes, the state talks about a statutory COLA, but we need to determine what our local COLA is, right? That's derived from our changes in ADA. Also, inflation. I was just reading the quarterly CASBO magazine, the summer 2025 magazine. Lovely publication. Nice job, Tasha and everyone. The CASBO, there it is. There it is. You look through there, you might see Eye of the Tiger. Who knows? That might ring a bell for some of you. But when we think about inflation, right, there was a quote in there from Mike Fine. A challenge that many LEAs are facing right now is the local cost pressures are not correlated at all to the COLA that is provided by the state, right? And that is so absolutely true. We see this at the negotiations table, especially when you get into some of the more coastal communities, higher cost areas in the state, even where Ahmad is. I know they're dealing with that. It's tough to get a 1% COLA, a 2.3% COLA, whatever it is, but then all of your community members, your employees are looking at 5, 6% CPI rates, right? That's a difficult conversation to have. So that's a couple of the stressors that are out there. Ahmad, I'll turn it over to you and let you share your thoughts on some of those as well.
Yeah, thank you, and good morning, everyone, and thank you, Matt, for that opening. I think a couple of other critical pressures out there, and the data statewide and my own personal experience shows that special education costs have been rising really rapidly, especially since the end of beginning of COVID. We've seen a lot of special ed cost rising, and that puts a lot of pressure on the general fund as we have to contribute more to that. We've seen a lot of, again, we talk about the AB 218 claims, but general insurance cost pressures, again, depending on where you are in the state, can be rising much higher than even inflation rates that we've seen. I think another big area has been the loss of the one-time funds. And that it manifests itself in a lot of different ways. Things that you kind of were able to fund, or things you were able to hide a little bit and get a little bit more out of your general fund, are suddenly going to be gone, and those costs are going to return into the unrestricted general fund. And so those if you're facing declining enrollment, facing increasing personnel costs, are going to really put pressure on the general fund and being able to balance it and not deficit spend.
And I think to both of your points, we're starting to see some of those decisions that were made a few years ago when funds were flowing. Again, those one-time funds have gone away, and decisions that were made that we've always cautioned against making those ongoing investments with those one-time dollars. And certainly those are coming into play. Ahmad, you have incorporated a BAC in your, I think, negotiations processes and perhaps others. I'd like to understand, how did you introduce it? Why did you introduce it? How did you decide to move towards that? And in a way that built support versus having, a mindset of maybe skepticism, since we're introducing these oftentimes during these budget pressures.
Great. Yes. I've had the fortunate experience to have it in both circumstances where you set up a budget advisory committee or a finance committee as an ongoing committee that is looking at the district finances on a regular basis, meeting quarterly or every other month to understand what is going on with the budget. You review the budget, you review first interim, second interim, you discuss the audit and other important information about the district on a regular, ongoing basis. And the idea for having a standing committee in that sense is to kind of build that sense of transparency and ability to rely on the district's finances, that it's not hidden, it's not opaque, but you're trying to make the beyond just the board members, others in the community who could be part of the budget advisory committee to understand the budget and create trust with the district's finances. And I think what that leads, if you have a standing committee that you've set up for that purpose, when there are stressors and when there are fiscal challenges, then you can rely upon that committee to help facilitate resolutions and to help bridge that communication gap that sometimes exists between the district and the community. At the same time, I've had also the need to have a specific committee that looks at reductions and really targeting their efforts. Hey, putting the committee together, it's going to be for the next 6 to 7 months. We're going to help the board identify reductions and going through that and kind of like a beginning and then an end. And they both have their purpose and need. Depending on what the district is trying to do, both of them can be helpful in bridging the knowledge gap and helping the board and the district make some critical decisions.
Yeah, and to tack on to that, when Ahmad highlighted this perfectly, but I really want to drive home the importance of what transparent and inclusive is. This is not just the interim approvals that go before the board. This is not just the public hearing for adopted budget. It's really intentional outreach to the community to say, hey, we want to set up something where we are bringing folks in. The district is sharing information, maybe even above and beyond what is shared at adopted budget, first interim, second interim, estimated actuals, and unaudited actuals, and saying we want to have some partners, we want to have some thought partners in this to really reinforce this notion of transparency. We have nothing to hide. Certainly when we think about negotiations, we would love to give 1,000% raises every year, right? Nobody thinks that giving raises to employees is a bad idea, but we have a saying in education, we can do anything, we just can't do everything, right? And it's about balancing those priorities. I think kind of segueing off of that, when we think about early, a lot of times when we see LEAs, they don't have a real strong, if any, sort of communication outreach on the budget side, right? As a parent, we get all the school messengers, we get all the updates, sometimes 2 and 3 times, and we go, oh my gosh, how many different ways are we going to get this? But when it comes to the finances, many LEAs, they just keep it to adopt a budget first interim, second interim, and that's fine. But when we see this in negotiations where LEAs tend to ramp up conversations around finance, they're already all the way through mediation on the precipice of fact finding. And the reason that they're starting to put communications out is because their community is receiving communications from other parties that are involved in the process. And the LEA goes, gosh, we should probably get some information out there too. This notion that Ahmad's talking about with starting early is saying, you know what, let's not wait until we're forced to put something out. Let's put something out in an ongoing manner so that we start to build that trust. We start to really exhibit, hey, we are transparent, we're here. Let's rock and roll with this. So great points, Ahmad, and I just wanted to add those couple of thoughts on there as well.
Yeah, and
Good.
thanks for tying in the important role during negotiations, right? Certainly we see in the news everywhere where we've got budget deficits across the state. And so that creates tremendous pressure for our LEAs. Let's talk about the structure and the formation of the BACs. Who's on them? I think you both have differing opinions of who should be on them, perhaps. But Ahmad, let's start with you. And really, who do you consider should be at the table, or maybe even who might be considered, even if unconventional?
Sure, sure. No, that's a good question. I think that a lot of the structure depends on how the committee is set up. If it becomes a committee that the board set up that has a specific structure, typically, that is ruled by the Brown Act, they may decide if they want 1 or 2 board members on that committee. They may decide the type of, they want a certain number of community members on there and how community members would get selected. the labor and different management will be on it. So that is really driven by the board and how they see the need of that. And typically that is a standing ongoing committee committed to looking at the finances to create district transparency and good communications as a long-term strategy. I've seen that work very effectively, and the people from outside the community might be people who are from the business community. There might be people who are auditors on that committee. There might be financial wizards, bond experts. There's a whole group of people that come in and really don't know school finance, but know numbers and know business and stuff like that. And they, with maybe one or two board members and other representatives on that group, really understand and do a deep dive on it. I've also seen it where it's a superintendent's committee, and mainly to advise the superintendent on the budget. And again, that committee may also include labor, community members, cabinet members, and board representation to assist the superintendent with the task of looking at the budget and coming up with either reductions or other things that the committee needs to look at. There is no one right answer. That's the key thing. It really depends on the needs of your community, understanding your board, understanding your superintendent, and setting it up. But what's really needed is to be transparent about the work you'll be doing, to be very communicate and really set out good goals and objectives for the work of the committee, and hold the committee process really in check to not go into tangents, really focus on what they're trying to do and how they're trying to help the organization.
Yeah, and
Matt?
when I think about the structure, I think about, well, what problem are we trying to solve here, right? So kind of going back to the opening sequence, the board does not want to have a board meeting where they are approving reductions and they've got 43 people lined up for public comment, right? So who are those parties that are most likely to have an active voice in the community, have an active voice in a board meeting? Right? Whether it's set up as a board committee that would have to be governed under the Brown Act, or it's a superintendent's committee, I think there's a lot of overlap in the parties that you would want represented at the table in a budget advisory committee. So certainly labor, our labor partners have to be a part of this process. And if they aren't involved in the process, recommending to them, we strongly, suggest that you participate in this process. Otherwise, we don't expect to see you at the board meeting when the cuts are approved. When we think about representatives from labor, and I think overall composition, we don't want this to be so big that it becomes unwieldy, right? I think size definitely does matter here, because we don't, it's one thing to have a standing committee where we know we're meeting quarterly. Okay, bring your folks along. But really, the purpose of a BAC when times are tough is we're looking for the BAC to bring forward recommendations to the board that says, hey, we as the BAC looked over everything. And we'll get into this a little bit more, but we as the BAC looked over the district's budget, and here's our recommendations for the board's consideration, right? So if you get, I'd say more than about 20 people, right, give or take, I think that becomes unwieldy, right? And even 20 could be considered a large group depending on the size of the LEA. But if we think, a couple representatives from each labor group that you have, certainly we're going to have, maybe a representative from a PTA, a couple parents from school site councils, who hopefully have some understanding of budget because they've been on the school site council, even if it is just very limited to those dollars that the school is spending. I don't love the idea of board members on the budget advisory committee, right? If the task of the BAC is to bring forward recommendations to the board. Again, I'll use a quote that Ron Bennett had in negotiations. When you get board members who come and sit at the table, that's lambs to the slaughter, because the board is the ultimate decision maker. So if it's perceived that a board member who is joining the BAC is the person that needs to be persuaded on any given topic, the attention goes to that board member and it becomes less about the group and gaining consensus. So I like to keep that. It's my auditor hat, right? It's separation of duties, internal controls. Let the BAC bring forward the recommendations to the full board without having the board in there helping to construct some of those recommendations.
Yeah, Matt, if I could just add, and I agree with that. When we created our BAC here in Pleasanton this last year, it was focused really on the task of looking at the budget, understanding, coming up with recommendations or helping come up with recommendations for the reductions. And we didn't have a board representative on that. When the board set up their own, a finance committee, governed by the Brown Act, they did select, they did want to have one board member on that committee, one or two, depending on which district I work for. So I do want to concur with that, Matt, what you're saying in my own experience here in the field.
Great, thanks, Ahmad. And then just the final piece for participants. Yes, the cabinet team is going to be has to be on this budget advisory committee. Certainly, we want to participate to gain consensus. We'll be able to share information. And quite honestly, a lot of the cabinet members who are participating, it's good to hear the conversations because you will be responsible for bringing some data back, which we'll talk about on the next slide. So between those categories right there, that'll probably get most LEAs into at least 15 people on the budget advisory committee.
I know we're going to talk about the clarity of roles, but specific to negotiations, is there any concern with the BAC almost becoming a bargaining table versus complementing the bargaining table? Matt?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. To me, when we think about the purpose of the BAC, they're coming up with recommendations for the board, right? For reductions. One of the talking points that we certainly would want to bring up when considering what recommendations need to go to the board is what is the impact of those recommendations, right? Do they need to be collectively bargained, or is it something that the board would be able to do unilaterally? To me, that would not preclude any recommendation from going to the board because, again, we have representatives, hopefully, from all of our employee groups, right, our employee associations, as well as community members in this room. Certainly, when we have a mix of associations in there, I don't think anyone would confuse that with at the table negotiations. But we're throwing ideas out there, right? An example might be, well, what if we increase class size, right? We certainly know that any increase to class size above what's in the CBA would require negotiation. But if that's an idea that's thrown out there and there's consensus of the BAC that, yeah, that's something that we could support in lieu of laying off our employees, then hey, let's go ahead and do that, right? So I think there is a pretty solid line in the sand there between what would be considered at the table negotiations versus what the task of the BAC would be.
That leads us sort of to norms. I think about confidentiality. You're throwing ideas around. You certainly don't want those to prematurely, leave the room. So what are some of the norms that you have found effective as you form and support the BACs?
Yeah, I think confidentiality, it is important. I think the folks in the room need to trust each other. Certainly, there's not going to be any sort of formal action if someone were to be like, hey, we talked about X, Y, and Z in there today. Because again, they are a representative of their community as they are here on the BAC. I think one norm and then one additional clarity item, and then I'll turn it over to Ahmad. I think on the norm, just recognizing that people are coming in with different levels of understanding, right? So just like we would have in a negotiation session, just like we would teach our children, be nice, have an open mind, right? Don't come in with presuppositions here. And one of the words that we use if we are facilitating this would be we don't want to have solutionitis, right? We don't want to jump straight to a solution. The BAC is really here to ask questions, gather data, and then only once we've understood what we're looking at and we have some data to support, then we get into those recommendations. So that to me is a norm. I think again on clarity, really being clear up front and bringing it back to each meeting. What is our purpose as the BAC, right? We are not a decision-making body, but we do need to roll our sleeves up and ultimately provide recommendations to the Board of Education. Because if you have folks that are used to like a school site council, as an example, that meeting may be a little more loose. You show up, there's some lemonade, there's some cookies, right? Your kids are sitting off to the side because you're going in between school and dinner or school and extracurriculars. The BACs are a lot of work, right? They leave the kids at home, show up with a full night's sleep, a big cup of coffee, and we're going to be doing some work in these meetings.
Ahmad?
Yeah, the that's true. It is a lot of work, but I think it does pay off at the end. My own experience was through that process, we had a lot less issues when we brought finally brought the information to the board and for the board to process. We had a lot more better buy-in. But I think that in terms of purpose and norms, it's important for the CBOs to bring a framework, but then to really allow the group um, to then make those norms theirs. That means they should be able to add to it, modify to it. One of the ones that was really important for us is you work the problem, not the people. It's not, you don't want, it's not personal. It's about working the issues. There's no idea is a bad idea. And, we rely on data and to kind of not on hearsay or feelings, but really look at data. So there are good norms. You want a participatory group that feels comfortable with their norms. You really want to establish the goals and the objectives of the committee, so it's really clear. So when you do go off on tangents, you recenter people, and don't sometimes you will have to pivot, and the superintendent will say, "Hey, we're going off task. This is where we need to focus on." Because again, with 10 to 12, 15 people in a room, it's easy to lose focus on these really important discussions.
Well, you've both brought up that first step of setting up that culture. Let's jump into these sessions and walk us through what happens. We kind of broke them into the first few meetings, but Ahmad, I'm going to ask you to share with us how you've set up yours and what took place in each one of those steps.
Yeah, so again, we talked about that orientation of, people getting to know each other, kind of knowing each person's background, if they're from labor, if they're a teacher, if they're in management, if they're in business, if they're in, they're a parent. That really is important, that first step. And then we talked about kind of the idea of really being clear on the norms and the goals and the mission. But once that's established, one of the things that we really learned quickly is that even if people are in schools, it could be teachers or it could be our classified folks or even others, they may not have a very strong background on the school finance and how it all works. And so you're going to have to take a good session after the orientations and the goal setting and the norming, really to dive deep into just the basics of school financing, even to, talking about what's restricted, unrestricted, one time, ongoing, how the LCFF works, how, state funding and federal funding and all of those things work. Because without that kind of background and basic information, you're not going to be able to find solutions. Again, they do not have our level of knowledge and expertise. So that was really important for us. And then we follow that up once they kind of had that knowledge, taking a couple sessions. Again, depends on the size of the group, how fast you can go through, how much information they may ask. You may come to one session and bring a set of information, and the group says, well, what about this and what about that? And you're going to have to go back in another session and bring more data. And so norming the group with the data, understanding enrollment, understanding your specific LCFF, supplemental concentration grants, federal, Title I, all of those will play into people really having an understanding of how the money comes in and how the money is spent. Without that background, which again may take up to 4 meetings, it's really hard to dive really deep into the solutions. And there's a lot of people who just want to jump into it, but you have to really set it up. And then that solutions and exploration may take several more meetings. I look back at our sessions. It took about 6 to 7 months, and we actually had 10 total meetings. And within that meeting, we had a midpoint or that we updated the board. We have a joint session with the board. So again, sometimes these will need to get adjusted, but I think the framework that is in front of you is a very good starting point.
Yeah, and I think when we lay out the framework here, Ahmad had talked about 10 meetings over 7 months. I don't want anyone thinking that, you're doing one meeting a week and this is only going to take 6 weeks. To really go through this process with fidelity, we need to give people time not only to digest the information, but I promise you, as a cabinet team, you're going to have some homework after each of these sessions, right? Because if we're doing this correct, the BAC needs to understand what they are looking at, and they're going to need additional information beyond just what the CBO presents about one-time versus ongoing, restricted versus unrestricted, right? It's going to be a deep dive into the finances. I want to highlight a point that Ahmad made early on is this orientation component, which could be the first 2 hours of the first meeting. Like we don't just, right, from the first meeting, Ahmad doesn't go, "Hi, I'm Ahmad. Here's one time, here's unrestricted." You don't just jump into that. It's the adage, go slow to go fast. If we have a group of 15 people that's a mishmash of cabinet, labor partners, and parents, well, the parents may not know anybody in that room, right? The labor partners may know the parents. Cabinet likely doesn't know the parents. We want to make sure everyone is familiar with each other. So even a couple icebreaker activities where we're not even focused on the ultimate goal of the BAC. We're just getting people familiar with each other, right? Getting people comfortable, because if people aren't comfortable, they aren't going to ask questions, they aren't going to share ideas, and they're just a warm body, right? That's heating up the room with their CO2 exports. So we want people to be active contributors in this. Really, really cannot overstate the importance of making people feel comfortable in the room. I loved everything Ahmad said. Once you get through that, then it's okay. It's going to be a little. One of our high school principals used to call all the testing a gulp and vomit method, where students would take it in and then they would have to spew it back out to learn the test. It's going to be a lot of gulping in the first 2 sessions, where we want all of our BAC members, we want to raise the bar on the knowledge of school finance so that everybody is at a relatively equal level, so that they can then use subsequent meetings to ask those informed questions, right? They're not going to be school finance experts. No one's going to walk out of there fluently speaking SACs, but we need them to at least understand what they are looking at here. Certainly through those conversations, as they ask questions, as we start to come up with solutions, then we are able to then circle back to some of that original conversations we had, some of that foundational learning, where we go, okay, if we're proposing this, well, what is the savings that would be generated? Are these one-time savings? Are they ongoing savings? Are they restricted savings? Are they unrestricted savings? And so it'll all come together on the back end there. I think I'll jump into 3 and 4 here, and then I'll kick it back over to Ahmad. I think it's one thing to give conceptual understanding of school finance, right? Things at that 10,000 foot level that apply to, all 1,000 school districts in the state of California. When you get into session 3 and 4, that to me is more of the local data, right? And so how do we get out of a budget, right? We either increase revenues or we decrease expenses. I don't think there's any other options out there. Those are our 2 options. And I know Ahmad has some thoughts, certainly in the area that he's in, this is more of an option. But generally speaking, it's very difficult for LEAs to increase revenues, right? We are not revenue generators like you see in the private industry, right? We are expenditure managers, right? So we spend a lot of time looking and analyzing at our expenses when we're building a budget, when we're monitoring our finances throughout the year. And so I do believe there's going to be a significant amount of time spent on looking at how we are spending our dollars, right? You probably hear this from multiple different outlets. Expenditures are a reflection of priorities. right? So as we're trying to move out of these bad times, what do we want our priorities to look like moving forward? And are there some things we're spending right now that are lower on the priority totem pole that don't necessarily reflect what we want to do going forward? Again, nothing is going to be easy coming out of this, but there are, once we start to come up with ideas, some things will certainly rise to the top as we want to keep this, which means the other things become the B and C list ideas of, okay, maybe we can let those go for now. A way that I like to frame the expenditures, right? We can't just give folks a SACS document and say go, right? So the way that I have split this up in the past, and I think Ahmad has probably done something similar to this, is we'll take our BAC and we'll break them up into 4 groups. And what those groups really reflect is it's a breakup of our general fund expenses, right? And so instead of just saying, hey, we've got teacher salaries, we've got classified salaries, we've got books and supplies and services, we don't look at it that way, right? That's very easy for us to digest, right, at that object level, but it's really more about functional expenses, kind of a mishmash of functional and object. So what we'll do is we'll have, 4 tables. One table will look at all of the expenses that are instruction related, right? So we think about our function there. We'll have another table look at administrative and clerical expenses. Another table will look at special ed transportation, and the fourth table will look at grounds maintenance and operations, right? So when we think about those 4 groups, we're able to capture all of our expenses that we would have in the general fund. And note, we're not talking at this point about the funding source for these. We're not talking about ongoing versus one time. We're just saying, here's what we're currently doing, and here's how we're breaking it up. I feel like that helps folks to really kind of narrow their focus to say, okay, I'm looking at special education, right? In that session 3 and 4, then the task of the committee, what data do you need as a committee to come up with some recommendations, right? We can't just say cut cut special education, right? Let's cut special education 20%. That doesn't make any sense, right? That's a nonsensical idea, right? But are there some conversations around special education that we can have, right? A question, and this is where some of the cabinet members can kind of sprinkle in some ideas, right? But a question may be, well, in special ed, do we have class size ratios? Are we at those caps, right? As we currently have it staffed? We don't know. We need some data, right? So we would have folks write on easel paper, or if you want to use a Google Doc or something to jot down all of those questions. And we can allow folks, this is a 45-minute to an hour session where they're brainstorming questions. What data do we need, right? We have the folks rotate to another table, right? So it gives them an opportunity to look at a couple different sections. So it's not just one group pigeonholed in special ed, one group making the instruction conversations, and we allow them to do that again, right? So that to me is integral. It is very, very important. And if you don't give the BAC an opportunity to do that, what is the BAC really doing? So I'm going to pause there, and I'm going to turn it back over to my other panel members to share some thoughts.
Great. Yeah, Matt, those were some really good details, and I want to reinforce some of them. One of them, yeah, in those first 2 sessions and in sessions 3 and 4, you want to break up. It can't be just, here's a dump of information. It has to be information you share and then Q&A. And from that Q&A, you learn what other pieces of data information that might be important and you need to bring back at the next session. So setting these up to be interactive is very critical. And another piece of data in that session 3 and 4 that became really critical is that the group needs to understand, well, what do we have control over? What can we really adjust in the budget? And so that's where we try to share information with the group. Is there are things that a school district needs to do by ed code, and in terms of educational program and special education and really the minimums. And then there are things, federal, other federal things that are the requirements that we need to meet. And then there are things that are driven by the local. It might be our collective bargaining agreement and other things that we have agreed to. And so for them to kind of understand the different buckets of dollars and how they're spent gives them a perspective of, okay, we love that music program, but that's not a requirement of the state. Or we really like our, to be able to have that program, but that's a local choice. And so for them to kind of understand what are local choices, what are requirements of the state and the federal government, and what are some of the collective bargaining parameters helps them when they go into sessions 5 and 6. And Matt, you said a really good point. When you go in sessions 5 and 6, you got to break it up. It has to be broken up because there's too many people. You're never going to be able to get through the work, and they need to be able to talk in their smaller groups and come up with ideas and suggestions that then roll up to the larger group. And then that information, once we kind of gathered it, you can do it by functional area, so on and so forth. That needs to come back to staff to go and work on it, right? To see like how can those ideas be actually captured in an actual reduction component. And then in the next session, the staff will bring that back, say, based on these ideas, here's where we're at. And then you'll get to a point where now you have enough ideas and options where you need to kind of then figure out, well, which one of these is based on those goals and those framework and those the things that the district values is higher priority and lower priority, so that somehow you can sift through all of the different options and then say, hey, based on the committee's work, these are the things of lower priority the district should first look at, and these are of higher priority the district should try to protect in their reduction planning. Because no one wants to make any reductions, but at some point you have to sift through it and also start to kind of indicate which ones is the committee willing to recommend to the board. And that recommendation can come in different ways. They can come, hey, we grouped them like this, we ranked them like this, so that you definitely want to give the board the wiggle room and the ability to make the final decision and not really box them in as to, oh, why did you go against the committee's recommendation? You kind of want to leave some flexibility in that. And there are different ways of ranking. There's different ways of grouping them in, 1, 2, 3 buckets that kind of allows the board to then weigh in and make some of those difficult decisions.
I want to go all the way back to the creation of the decision-making framework. What advice do you have to facilitate that? Because that seems like it could be a tremendous bottleneck. We've got all this data and we need to make some decisions around it. How do you facilitate that up front and get that clarity? What ideas do you have?
Yeah, so I think as you establish the norms, right? Be nice, phones down, all that jazz. You get through the icebreakers. I think you could even start with, we need to come up with some sort of framework, right? Really reinforcing for the committee what their task is here is that we will be evaluating decisions, and we're going to need a rubric to evaluate that against. Certainly, I think having a starting point, a skeleton, so that we don't spend 2 meetings coming up with a rubric, I think is helpful. But that's their first task. What rubric do we want to use to evaluate these decisions? And people need to have clarity over really what it is they're doing. So again, this is another learning opportunity to reinforce we are tasked with bringing recommendations to the board, right? The recommendations, as Ahmad said, it can't just be a recommendation. There has to be a recommendation. Here's how we came up with it. Here's what we think the potential pitfalls might be around that or the consequences of that type of decision. Yet, that is still a decision that has risen to the top from the BAC. So again, a lot of work goes into this. This is not just a cut from the top, cut management, right? Which is something we hear in negotiations. A lot of people are really surprised to realize that, well, management, that's only 4% of spending. So if we cut all management, we still have a hole and we've got no one steering the ship, right? So a lot of this is guiding folks where, someone like Ahmad, who is so well versed in school finance, knows most of the things in the services and other operating, right? We have to do utilities, insurance. We had highlighted the AB 218 claims on the first slide. those are things we don't get decisions around whether or not we do that. We have to do those things, right? There's not a lot of meat on the bone in the services. There's not a lot of meat on the bone in administration. There's not a lot of meat on the bone in books and supplies. So even though folks don't want to cut, right? Everyone says cut furthest from the classroom, don't cut people. Fact of the matter is, if we have a BAC, we're probably looking at cutting some people, right? And we need to get the BAC there. It just takes some time to get there.
Yeah. I wanted to, one thing that we didn't point out, and I think that Matt, you alluded to, again, it all depends on the district, your unique situation. But our group really wanted to also look at potential revenue opportunities. They felt that that was something that shouldn't be overlooked. And they came up with great ideas. And, we try to look at properties and our assets differently. Can we increase rentals and leases? Can we make sure that our facility fee recovery from the use of our facilities is maximized? Again, depending on the type of community, looking at potentially parcel tax, that is one of the reasons you want to have a committee like this and a standing committee, because if the district wants to go there, it takes a lot of work, right? And it doesn't just happen immediately. You have to work with a lot of constituents in the community to look at that. Looking at partnerships with the city, with other organizations, and looking at grants and having people look at other opportunities like that. That again, it may not solve the entire gap, but even if it gets you somewhere closer, people will see that you're thinking out of the box, that you're trying to be innovative, and that kind of fosters good positive relationships with everyone in the community.
And can I just say one more thing on timing here? I know we talked about the fact that this is not a 6-week process, but for those who are thinking about, okay, when do I need to start something like this to impact the 26-27 fiscal year, right? It's already too late for 25-26. I would say to impact the 26-27 year now, right now, and it's almost too late. If you think that you're going to have, 6 meetings, 1 meeting per month, if you start that in July, that takes you all the way to December. If there's decisions that come out of that budget advisory committee that the board ultimately wants to enact and they impact people, there's layoff timelines, right? So we need to have that information really by December. January's pushing it, certainly for our HR friends. That would be difficult to get everything they need to do if they don't get approval from the board before January. Beyond that, now we're looking at 27-28 reductions, right? So again, if you've got a standing committee, that's great. But if you're really getting this BAC together to make recommendations to the board, the time to start for the 26-27 fiscal year is now, so that everyone has time. The process can be played out with fidelity, and it doesn't look like the answers were preconceived in the closet, and then we had, or the closet, that's not the right word, in a room somewhere with 3 people. That it really was a transparent, collaborative process where consensus was reached.
Thank you both. I do want to note that if you need a resource for those early conversations, session 1 and 2, basic budget concepts and the like, we are going to be posting in chat, if we haven't already, the bottom line. This is used around the state with both the community, our boards, to really break down how the budget or how finance works in California in support of the public schools. So you'll see that there. So let's bring it home to some questions that we might have from the group. I'm going to pose one really quickly, but I would love to hear any missteps to watch out for. I'll take the slide down in a moment, but what are missteps that could take place with the BACs that we want to be cautious of?
So I think the biggest one is not giving it sufficient time, right? Thinking that this can be done in a month and a half or 2 months, and you're going to get any sort of result that can be brought forward to the board with fidelity. To me, that would just be a waste of a month and a half or 2 months if that's the plan.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think time is of the essence. It takes time to work through it. I mean, we all have our regular jobs and we know what that entails. And you add this to it, you know, and you sometimes you'll have to chase data and information for the committee, and they're asking for it, and it takes work and time to put those things together. It works building those relationships, having those conversations. Another one is you have to be agile. You cannot go into it without knowing sometimes you will have to pivot. And it could be like, hey, I went too fast, I need to slow down. Or we were looking at a hard recommendation and no, the board does not want hard recommendations, they want general guidance. So you have to be able to pivot. The other thing is you will have sometimes, especially when you appoint community members, that they may kind of be going off and in a tangent or really being disruptive to the goal and the where you're trying to get to. And so those are sometimes will require the superintendent or the chair of the committee, if you have a chair of the committee, to have a conversation with that individual and say, look, we're happy you're on the committee, but you know you have to stay within this framework. And so that was really important for us. We had to we selected a chair within that committee, which was not a district personnel, and that was a trusted person within our organization that we worked with very well. But they had to have a couple of those conversations with some members to bring them. So just be ready to pivot and bring it back to you, Max. I think I see your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to tag on to that. When we think about the composition of our BAC, it should have some community members in there and just really reinforcing what the objective is. And this is hard work. It doesn't make sense to have people coming in and out, right? If you're there for the first meeting, we need you there all the way to the end. Because if someone's there for the first two meetings and then they tap another parent from the school site council to go to meetings 3 and 4, that parent's going to be so lost in meeting 3 and 4. I think with that, giving people a defined timeline that, hey, this is a commitment. This is the period that we're looking at right now. Plan for one meeting a month, every month, right? For 6 months or something like that. So people know what they're getting into. Because again, I think a lot of folks would look at this and go, oh yeah, I'm sure I'll go on that. I'm bored right now. This is not something to do if you're bored. This is something to do if you really want to contribute and you really want to understand. So being clear with the members on what the expectations are.
Thank you. We have some questions from our audience. When sharing out, do you do this in a style of joint communication?
So the way that I see it is if you have a facilitator that's leading it, the facilitator could, I don't think you need updates after every meeting, but certainly if the board wants to be kept apprised, I think maybe a written communication from the facilitators to the board. Certainly once it's all said and done, right? A formal presentation that is agendized for the board that says, here's the recommendations that came from the BAC. I don't think it needs to be an action item at that point. It's just informational, and then the board can take that information and run with it. I guess I don't know if the person can clarify when they say joint communication, who's the joint in that? To me, it's just a committee communication to the board.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's the way we did. So we wanted to create transparency. So we actually created a budget advisory committee webpage, and we posted our, after the meeting, we posted our presentation so people knew what we were talking about, and there wasn't anything secret or hiding. We didn't we didn't do meeting notes and post those up because that was kind of, we wanted to, people feel comfortable speaking and stuff like that, but people could definitely follow the materials that were being presented, and then the final, obviously, information that would go to the board in terms of their report out to the board. That was also public information.
Got some great questions coming in. I'm going to start with our BAC members compensated. That would be an interesting conversation in the context of the budget.
Yeah, it didn't come up. It was always, I mean, when it was communicated out, obviously staff are there and they're working, but even to our labor partners and to our community members who were participating in this, we just communicate this is volunteer, you're participating in a process, and they were not compensated.
Right. It's a labor of love. You get food, right? You get lunch and coffee in the morning. But no, this because if you think about it, with most BACs, the district is already in financial distress. So to have more cash outflow, no.
Do you ever recommend an external facilitator?
Yeah, I mean it's a lot of work just being on the committee. And I would always recommend that you've got those cabinet member representatives that can speak to the different areas. So, business obviously has a very active role in presenting. C&I is going to have an active role when we start to talk about how are we spending our money, getting the additional data there. Special ed, same thing. Even HR is going to have a role in gathering some data. I don't know that I would recommend a superintendent be the facilitator unless they are superintendent extraordinaire and they want this task on their plate. So my advice would always be to get a facilitator to handle it. So that would let the cabinet members not only gather the data and be active participants, they don't have to worry about developing the agenda. They don't have to worry about crowd control. Let an expert come in and facilitate and run the meetings.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean,
Sorry,
yeah.
go ahead. Go
No, I
ahead.
mean, I agree with what Matt said. It all depends on the size, the complexity, the issues. Again, we chose an internal person within the committee to be the committee chair. That was really helpful for us. But I do think that, having a trusted person be a facilitator sometimes is extremely helpful because as staff, you're going to be doing a lot of the work behind the scenes for these meetings.
We have 4 minutes left. Let's talk about what happens when the cabinet member or superintendent don't accept the recommendations or don't move forward or support those recommendations. How do you handle that?
Matt, I'll try first because so the way we handled that was we created that framework and we kind of created a prioritization and kind of like bucket 1, 2, and 3, and also the impacts. How much does it impact students? Does it impact operations? Does it have a legal impact? So the information came to the management and executive cabinet in a form that gave them flexibility, right? And so that information was then taken and then shared with the board. In our situation, our board really wanted not to be boxed in. They wanted give us the data, the information that you've put together, the best of your knowledge, and the best of the executive cabinet's information, and then that became a starting point for them to work rather than a hard recommendation, right? And so that's something that, again, is going to depend differently on your board, your community, and you have to feel it out. If the board really wants a high level recommendation coming out of this committee with the management, then that's what you're going to have to work towards. So it really depends on the direction that the board and the superintendent want to take the committee.
Yeah, and I'll second what Ahmad said. I think it starts with board. What do you want from this budget advisory committee? Do you want an itemized list that you have to follow explicitly, or do you want a sandbox to play in? And I would always advocate for the sandbox. And so the way Ahmad said it is, as the committee is coming up with the recommendations, right? The facilitator or whomever is leading is very clear with the committee. Look, we're going to come up with some recommendations. This is not an itemized list. We don't go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's here's a group of recommendations that we all have consensus on. Second group, maybe half of us have consensus, half of us don't. And a third group, nobody liked those ideas, right? And then you give that to the board, and then the board then can go, okay, if the board's doing it right, they're going to focus on box one and say within this box, which of those recommendations do we want to do first? How do we want to prioritize that? Yeah, I would never recommend a committee give an itemized, prioritized list to a board. That's not going to go well. Kind of like we see with bonds. We ask communities to pass bonds. Here's right the projects that could be financed by those bonds. We're not giving the community an explicit list, right? That's up to the board to decide how to spend those bond dollars if it indeed passes.
We like options. Our final question with just a moment is we've been asked if there's support for small districts. If you can't afford a facilitator, I'm going to suggest school services, but what ideas might you have in terms of that?
If they're looking for a free facilitator or they need to keep it in-house.
Yeah, great question.
I don't know if I hate to put it on county offices. I don't know if a county office would be able to pull together some resources to share. I know a lot of the smalls, as you get into some of the more rural counties, they might have some similar challenges. So maybe working with the county office to use get a little more economy of scale, right? If you have a handful of districts that are facing some challenges, maybe the county can step in and replicate some information for each of the smalls.
Thank you. All right, we are at the top of the hour. I want to thank Ahmad and Matt for sharing both your experience and your insight in this session today. As a reminder for everyone, it has been recorded. We will be sharing that out in short order. And at the last page of that deck, you'll see both Ahmad and Matt's contact information, as well as my own, should you like to reach out and just ask any more questions, get any more support. Thank you for joining us today, Ahmad, Matt, and all of our audience.
All right,
You're welcome.
thanks.
Thank you.
Bye,
Have a great
everyone.
day.
Bye.